You guys, look at all these classics. These are classics that are actually fun to read, that are easy to read. These are not things that you're gonna be forcing yourself to read because you know you feel like you should read them. So what's in here for you? Okay, I'm not gonna go in any particular order. I'm just gonna go kinda, you know, how they're stacked up. So let's start with The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Now this is about a man who essentially sells his soul to the devil so that he can remain forever young. And there is a painting where essentially every sin, he lives this debauched life, right? Every sin that he commits, it is shown on this painting that becomes a grotesque, disgusting picture of what his soul is really like. It's easy reading. You know how sometimes with classics, the language is just, it sort of gets in the way and you have to really concentrate to understand what's happening. Not like this at all. This is fast, it's a page turner. Very good. H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds. Now, I actually recently just read this about 6 months ago, and I was just struck by how imaginative it was. I actually could not put it down. It was so good. We all probably know the story, and it was pretty interesting also just from like a scientific perspective, like what people understood in the early 1900s. I was surprised by how much they'd already figured out. I mean, I had no idea, you know, I'm not a science historian, so it was very interesting from that perspective as well. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So that and 1984 by George Orwell. These are both books where it's easy to get through them. The language is easy. You're gonna find yourself wanting to, you know, find out what happens. And I feel like in the weird, you know, modern era that we live in, these are very, very good to read. I was particularly struck by Aldous Huxley because he actually studied to become a doctor until he became blind, I think from a virus or something that he caught. And so he couldn't become a doctor and he became a writer instead. So it's very interesting what he said in terms of the medical profession. I actually found that particularly fascinating. So if you've ever read this, or if you do read it and then, you know, you kind of have the same thoughts, I'd love to hear your opinion on it. And then of course, 1984, this is a good one to read, you know, anytime. Okay, All Quiet on the Western Front. This is a story by Erich Maria Remarque, who was a German soldier in World War I, and this is basically, it's almost like a memoir. It's technically fiction, but it's very obvious that what he's writing is essentially what he experienced. And it is just so beautifully written. It's not hard, you know, the language is not hard at all. First, you know, couple chapters, I was already like crying hysterically. Just one of those books that shows you, you know, how the common man is, you know, trampled upon by bigger governments, by big companies, by financial interests, who they're basically just cannon fodder, and how this happens. So absolutely phenomenal. Another World War I book that you should read, Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves. So this actually is a memoir, and he was a British soldier in World War I, and this doesn't just talk about World War I, it's essentially of his whole life, starting from when he's a kid at these British public schools, and his humor is hilarious. I mean, there was times when I was literally laughing out loud, and he just shows, you know, kind of like the stupidity of the bureaucracy of the British Army. I mean, it's just funny. It's even though it's dealing with a hard topic, I flew through this one. And then of course, if you've never read the Anne series, this, I mean, my daughter, I have Anne of Avonlea right now. My daughter is reading Anne of Green Gables right now, so that's why I don't have this book, and she's just loving it. She's like, oh mommy, I can't believe it. Like, will Anne ever be able to play with Diana again? It's so, I've read this series probably 5 or 6 times, the whole thing. Just a great, great series. And then I'm showing you Emma right here from Jane Austen, but any of the Jane Austen books I feel like are a good book to pick up if you're looking to read some classics but you don't want something that's super, super hard. I mean, the language is fairly easy. You're going to be wanting to get through them. If you've never read the Jane Austen books, I highly recommend it. And then I don't have on me, but Jane Eyre, that's another one. You know, I feel like someone, you know, a precocious middle schooler or a high schooler, they could easily read Jane Eyre and love it. It's not hard to follow along, but it's making you want to turn the page, right? Another fantastic classic. The easiest 1,200 pages you will ever read is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. I recently did a video about how this could be the greatest soap opera. So if it was remade, so if the queen of soap operas, Shonda Rhimes, decided that she wanted to make her greatest soap opera of all time, I mean, that is a big, big hurdle to climb because she's done the greatest soap operas of our time, you know, with Grey's Anatomy, Bridgerton, Scandal. This is the greatest soap opera ever written, and if she recreated it, it would be the greatest soap opera of all time. Now let's talk about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So this has got some real gothic vibes. It's about an unnamed narrator who gets married to this mysterious British man. She's British herself. He takes her away to an estate by the sea, Manderley, and then there's this ghost, this scepter of his dead wife, Rebecca. Very, very good. Now I didn't realize that this was technically a classic, but Penguin Random House said it was a classic, so I'm going to put it in here, and that's Truman Capote in Cold Blood. So Truman Capote is credited as creating the literary genre of literary nonfiction, where essentially you are reading a story of nonfiction and it reads like a story of fiction. This is about 4 murders that happen in a small Kansas town, and essentially what Truman Capote does is he goes to investigate these murders, investigates what happens. In the process, some people think that he actually fell in love with one of the murderers. You gotta read this book to see if you agree, but it is gripping. The writing is so beautiful. It sweeps you in and you can't put it down. Now another one you should read is To Kill a Mockingbird. I know I just talked about Truman Capote in Cold Blood, but actually Harper Lee, she helped Truman Capote write this book. So this is one that, you know, you probably had to read it in high school. I would recommend reading it again. It's definitely really good. Language is not hard in any way, shape, or form. Great one. And then of course, I cannot make this list without putting The Lord of the Rings on here. Now this is my copy of The Lord of the Rings. This was given to me more than 20 years ago, the first gift my husband, then my boyfriend, ever gave to me. This has so much nostalgia for me. I haven't reread it in a really long time. Maybe that should be a project that I do next year, is reread this one. But such a beautiful story of good versus evil. Now, if you are looking for Russian literature, so Russian literature, it's kind of hard to ever put it on a list of something that's easy to read. You've got these huge, giant novels. But if you want to get a taste of Russian literature, I recommend A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Easy to read. It's about a guy who's in a Soviet-era prison and just his day in the life. And then also, I would recommend short stories by Anton Chekhov. Many people believe that Anton Chekhov is one of the greatest short story writers of all time. So if you're looking to, dip your toe into Russian literature, that's a way to do it. Since I did mention 1984 by George Orwell, I feel like Animal Farm is another one it's a fun read, it's a quick read, and it's a read that's not, super difficult. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, along the same vein of 1984 and Brave New World. Again, it's not hard to read at all, actually very fun to read, so pick that one up if you haven't. Call of the Wild by Jack London. Now, I haven't read this one in a really long time, but I do remember that when I first read it as a kid, I think I was like 10 years old, I was just completely enthralled by it. The language wasn't that difficult at all. I'm sure there was stuff that I missed, but it was a thrilling read. If you've never read it, highly, highly recommend picking that one up. It's actually probably a good read for the winter as well. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. This actually had, when I first read it, an emotional impact on me that I kept thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I remember one of my college essays that I wrote about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and how the main character, Randall McMurphy, how he essentially sacrifices himself was so moving that it was just such a beautiful story. Another great one to read is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Now this is one, again, I'm giving you books here that you can easily get through. The language is beautiful, but it's not difficult language. There's not a lot of words that you're gonna be like, what does this mean? A beautiful story, a beautiful writer. Another story that I really loved, had a great impact on me, and that I didn't find too difficult, and that also that I was very much turning the pages, was Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And then if you're looking for, a Charles Dickens book, Charles Dickens, to me, he does take some time to get into it in terms of getting used to his style of writing. It is a little difficult. I find Charles Dickens books, I really like them, but they're a little bit difficult to read. But one that if you've never read Charles Dickens and you'd like to, A Christmas Carol. Very simple to read. Good one to read, around this time. I'm not sure when I'm going to post this video, but I'm assuming it's going to be around Christmas time. So if you've never read that, I would highly recommend picking that up. And then Little Women. Now this is another one that is beloved by the younger generation, right? If you've never read Little Women, it is a great story. It's so fun to read. It's a larger book, but it's one that you get through very, very quickly. And then I would recommend watching the most recent movie after that. I thought it was a great adaptation.